And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome to Open Connection. I'm your host, Robert Pictou. Our show today comes to you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Tsimshian people. Prior to the introduction of the Indian Act in 1876, communities were self-governing and leadership was designated according to each community's tradition. Under the Indian Act, elections became cumbersome. People could be nominated without consent. On today's Open Connection, Heisler member Ellis shares how he got elected to council.
And somebody told me that said, hey, your name has been nominated to run for council. And I, oh, okay. So I just let it stand. And I thought about it and I said, you know what? I should be able to take a lot of council's vast resources and huge bank account and I can divert it to my basketball teams because we were having problems raising money for traveling and whatnot. So when I got into council, I thought, yeah, I'm going to find a way to find money for my teams. It took me maybe a month to realize my council was broke. They had no money. In fact, they were at a deficit. They owed $3.5 million to different creditors. And then when I found out that the majority of the money came from the Indian Act, coming from Ottawa, you know, that, okay, so much for getting money from my teams. And then after that, I started to understand more about council processes and then started to reach into Indian Act funding agreements. And basically, they made me chairman of treaty negotiations for 8 years. And that's where I started to understand the nature of the Indian Act and basically how hopeless it was for me to try to achieve anything for the people I was representing. Every time I tried to propose something, it came back, well, you can't do that because the funding agreement won't allow it. Oh, the Indian Act won't allow it. And it was just, and I got so discouraged about it. And so that's basically how I got my start. Back then, the buzzword was self-governance. And because I was treaty chairman, I took it upon myself to start reading up on what governance actually is. And I compared it to what we were doing, and I thought to myself, this is not governance what we're doing. Give you an example, I often wondered why the Canadian government, the federal government, would have elections, but programs would keep getting delivered. Whereas with my chief and council, it was like, you know, there was always somebody who was going to say, I'm going to clean house, I'm going to stop that, I'm going to stop that. So anything that we signed back then was always in danger of being ripped up by the next council. Whereas true governance had a staff and bureaucracy underneath it that promoted continuity and certainty. And so I kind of drifted away from that idea of self-governance and say, guys, we should really be looking at independence because we got a long way to go before we start to become a real government. We'll get there one day, but I think we should start creating the foundation for independence first. And yeah, so I read up on everything I could think of in terms of the Indian Act, governance, economics, because I had to. I was treaty chairman, plus I felt I had to understand the job in terms of what I was expected to do, which I didn't even understand myself. I didn't understand what I was supposed to do. And we didn't have a very good relationship with District Kitimat, basically because of the segregation. Under the Indian Act on reserve, we just dealt with Indian Act issues. It was actually a chief counselor that came in before I did. His name was Steve Wilson, and he promoted the idea of going after things outside of our village. He promoted the idea of going after issues related to the Aboriginal rights and title case law, which I didn't know what that was either. And you know, it's Section 35 of the Constitution. It's all these court cases like Gladstone and you know, the Mikisew Cree, Delgamu. And so I had to research all of that. And then, so he's the one that actually took our council basically to go outside our reserve, outside the Indian Act, and start exploring relationship to the provincial government, relationship to the municipality, relationship with Canada. And so that's how the council started to evolve outside of Indian Act issues. I did 8 years as a councillor, and then I ran for chief councillor. And by that time, I I really decided that I had learned enough about the Indian Act, learned enough about provincial government, federal government governance. So I decided that basically I'm not gonna follow the rules anymore. I'm not gonna follow the Indian Act. I'm not gonna follow the funding agreements, and I'm gonna stop fighting with the provincial government on permits and referrals. I'm going to try to find a way. By that time, we brought in a political lobbyist who taught us what provincial governments was all about and what federal governments was all about. And I remember the day I was chief counsellor, I got another letter from the provincial government regarding a permit that was coming through our territory. These were coming in by the hundreds every year. And we were on a break at a council meeting. I looked at it and I just went, ugh. And one of my advisors asked me, he said, so what's wrong? I said, I got another letter from the provincial government. I said, there's got to be a better way. All I do is fight, fight, fight. Sometimes I win, sometimes I lose, but nothing changes. My people are still in poverty. Nothing changes. There's got to be a better way. So he said, why don't you try a lobbyist? Of course, I'm like, oh, what's a lobbyist? And so we interviewed this guy in Vancouver, and he said, yeah, I'll take you guys on, but you guys got to do what I say. You know, you guys say what I tell you to say, because you got to understand government. And they asked me to do it. And so just the more I understood that in terms of understanding government and politics, the more I understood that we could achieve the idea of working with government. And Christy Clark came in after that, and she said, yeah, I love this idea of LNG. I love it. Let's get together. Let's start working on it. And instead of pounding a table and, criticizing government and yelling and screaming, we sat down and we developed this relationship where I said, man, if I have a problem, Premier, can I talk to you? Figure it out, and then let's let our staff do the details. And she said, yeah, great. And it worked perfectly. I thought it was a true definition of government-to-government relationships without signing a document, without having lawyers, right? It was a great time, and it's basically what sped up LNG development in BC.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Thank you for staying with us. There are 8 liquefied natural gas export projects in various stages in development across Canada. Cumulatively, these projects represent a possible capital investment of almost $109 billion. Let us return the conversation as Ellis shares a conversation he had with then CEO of LNG Canada, Andy Clance.
I remember the day that I got so discouraged. I was so discouraged that I wasn't getting anything really done. We were signing agreements. We were doing a lot of achievements. We were acquiring land. We were actually bringing in revenue. But LNG Canada took me down to Vancouver along with my counsel. And Andy Clance told me in a private room, he said, hey, we're not going to make our investment decision. And he cried about it in front of me. And I was thinking, oh man, we're done. It was the basis of our future. It was the basis of the future of the region. And I could see services coming to Kitimat and Terrace. I could see jobs being brought in and revenues. And so basically I canceled all the meetings that week. I kicked my counsel out of the boardroom. And for about a week I was thinking, just in a very dark place. And I was trying to think, what can I do? I can't do anything. I've done as much as I could. So I thought, yeah, it's time to do something else. I got to get to a higher level. And so I decided to run for the MLA, and it was quite interesting because the council didn't know how to deal with it. They didn't want me to see me leave. So they offered me $50,000 pay increase, which I turned down. I said, no, it's not about the money. It's about the region, it's about the people, it's about the community. So tell you what, just to avoid confusion, I quit. I had no plan on how to be an MLA. I had no idea how to campaign. I just said, yeah, I quit. I'm going to run for MLA. And then I got a rude awakening in terms of what that meant. So I really don't know what I was thinking. It all just seemed to happen. But I was lucky. I had a lot of good, strong supporters. I had a good campaign manager, and a lot of people came together to kind of put it all together for me. I'm a lot smarter about it now, but back then it was just, it was an act of desperation to try to see what we could do to help build up the region. And it's, I don't know if I could have done it any different back then, but you know, I'm certainly more knowledgeable today than I was back then. Minister of LNG Development and Housing. And it was, as a minister, oh man, I was like 18 days or 20 days. And every single day for like 10 to 12 hours a day, all I was doing was taking meetings and reading. And really, the staff would bring in, you know, Mr. Ross, you better have something to eat. And I was and it was just relentless. It was just, and I was trying to absorb all this information about being a minister, about housing issues across BC. But I knew LNG development. I lived it already. But trying to learn every facet of being a minister, of being an MLA, and then trying to think about all the issues back home that I was supposed to be doing as well. You know, I had to set up my office, for example. I had to figure out exactly what it is that the region needed. So it was and I didn't understand what was going on because we won the election. We won the election. So I thought, okay, this is my life. I'm gonna be doing this for 10 hours a day for 7 days a week. But the NDP and the Green Party teamed up in the legislature and they took over government. So even though we won the election, we lost. And I'm sitting there going, what's going on? Now I understand that the guy that actually helped me through it a lot was John Rustad. He was a Minister of Indigenous Affairs before I became an MLA. And I used to like beating up on him a lot, right? But we became good friends. So he basically, he sat beside me in my first year, and he would tell me about, you know, a lot of things that were going on. And I remember one time I was sitting there, I wasn't paying attention, I was reading my book, right? I was trying to get ready for a question if they asked me one. And in the legislature, when you're asking questions, people pound the table and clap. And I was sitting there reading my book, and I heard everybody clapping, so I didn't look up and I started clapping. And John grabs my hand and he said, "What are you doing?" It was the NDP that were clapping. So yeah, it's been a long process, but it's been one of the most interesting processes I've ever. I still think that the model of governance in BC is the best one I've come across. I'm fascinated by the process, fascinated by the procedures. I truly believe it reflects democracy, if it's carried out in the truest sense of governance, good governance. And I've said before, the Westminster model is a great model.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome back to Open Connection. The Indian Act is a primary law the federal government uses to administer Indian status, local First Nations governments, and the management of reserve land. It also outlines governmental obligations to First Nations peoples. Let us return the conversation with Ellis Ross.
You know, about 6 or 7 years ago, I was asked to run federal. And at that time, I said, no, I don't have the brains for that. That's not me. I'm just a chief counselor. But that was the original plan. But I was so leery of it. But then I came to understand that MLAs and MPs, for the most part, are just regular people. That's why they call it the House of Commons. It's common people. I don't think there's anybody more common than me. But anyway, it was the provincial election came along first. And at that time, the timing was I was so depressed about LNG not getting built, and Christy Clark was going to come along. But it was always in the back of my mind that thinking, you know, I know the federal Conservatives still want me to run for them. But I never thought that day would come. Because people got to understand, what I learned working for Chief in Council was what is true governance. how do you build an economy? And people are surprised when I tell them, I said, I'm a big champion of freedom and liberties. And I don't know why people are surprised, because natives of all people understand what it means to have rights taken away from them and liberties. The Indian Act itself restricted natives to reserves. You had to get a pass, a written pass from the Indian agent to leave your reserve to go pick berries. You weren't allowed to have potlatches. You weren't allowed to hire lawyers to fight against the government. You weren't allowed to own property. You weren't even allowed to vote. And so when I was researching this, when I was researching the Indian Act, and I matched it up with what good governance was, especially in terms of Canada, freedom and liberties and the power of government was something I researched heavily, not only in Canada, but all across the world in terms of different kinds of governance. And so I've always believed that no matter what happens, you've got to keep in the back of your mind that Canada should be a free country. I mean, that's what Canada was built on. So you combine all this stuff together. And then, by the way, I'm a fan of international issues as well. I've researched wars all over the world. I watch documentaries as much as I can, but I've also watched what's happening globally in terms of global emissions. I've watched what's happening in terms of global trade. We have no real relationship with, say, a country like India or China. We're starting to develop the beginning of a relationship with Japan for our ammonia coming out of Alberta, going through Prince Rupert. But it's not enough. I'm also, because I follow up a lot of research on wars, you'll see that countries that don't maintain their military become victims of the overpowering nations. So in Canada, if you're going to ignore your military, you're going to be at the mercy of other countries that build up their military. I mean, we're never going to become a world power. We're not going to become a superpower. But you have a superpower just to the south of you that needs your support. There's other free and democratic countries across the world that are saying, Canada, where are you? We need your support. You can't just keep criticizing the world without actually stepping up. And you think about what Canada did in World War II. It almost defined this country of Canada when they built up and sent a military force over to help with World War II. So there's a lot of things that I think that go into making a strong country that I think that have fallen to the wayside. And if I'm thinking that with my beliefs and my principles, I can be a voice, especially for BC.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Last week, MLA Ellis Ross stated, "My whole career has been about standing up for people of Skeena. I've been fighting for better jobs and safer streets. I've been advocating for BC's resource sector while others apologize for it. As a member of Parliament, I'm going to bring that same fight to Ottawa." In this final segment of Open Connection, Ellis shares his decision process.
Yeah, it's been a long process. It took quite a few months to figure out exactly what I was going to do. I've been thinking about it for 6 months, but I've been talking to a lot of people, getting a lot of different people's opinion. And the last person I had to talk to and convince was my wife, Tracy. And the clincher for us was saying that, look, given where we come from, our circumstances, we come from a small Indian reserve. We were born with a wooden spoon in our mouth, right? Fisherman father. Mother that did everything she could to provide for her family, did a very good job. But we come from very humble backgrounds, and now we've been given this incredible opportunity to be elected to council, then to elect to be chief councillor, then elected to be an MLA, and now I'm asked to represent BC in Ottawa. I find this extraordinary. I don't think our family has really come to grips with it, to say, how does this guy, comes from a poor background basically, how does he get here? And I don't know, it's for some reason I was spared, even though I made the same mistakes as every other Aboriginal did, I was spared the horrible outcome. And I can't tell you why, I really can't tell you why, there doesn't seem to be a reason. But that was a clincher for me and my wife in saying that this is an opportunity that's not afforded to everybody. And given where we come from, we can't really say no to it. I mean, it's just, there was a reporter that actually put it quite nicely. He said, are you ready for the next challenge? That's actually a pretty good way of putting it. It's a challenge. It was a challenge for me to be a councillor. Challenge to be a chief councillor. Challenge to be an MLA. I mean, if anybody thinks that you can walk into this job and just do it right, like you know what you're doing, no, I'll call you on that. Any new initiative that you can enter, you know, you have to be a bit nervous. You have to be a bit apprehensive. I'm lucky in this case though, because I have all my experience as chief councillor and council. I have the experience of a legislator being in Victoria. But I do know I have a lot to learn in terms of federal politics and federal governance. But I do believe I have the foundation, but it's just, I don't know, it's a unique circumstance, I think. Very unique, and I'm very honored, of course. I'm very humbled about this opportunity, but...
What would you make sure that the people know about you and what you're going to be doing for the region?
Basically what I've been doing for the last 20 years. I haven't changed my principles in terms of why I do this. I do this so people can have a good life, so they can build their own life, so they can be independent, with as less government intrusion as possible. Coming from the Indian Act, I don't like the idea of government controlling our lives. I like to build up a strong economy where people can see their future. Whereas me as a grandfather, I can say, I know my grandson has the option to stay in Kitimat and raise a family. I want my family and friends to be close. I want them to be able to get a mortgage. I want them to be able to go on vacation. I like them to be able to go play hockey. I like them to be able to go play basketball, soccer, no matter what it is. And the only way I can do that, if you can do that in an independent fashion, is create a strong economy so they can build their own lives. It doesn't make any sense to send our kids away to be a doctor and then find out you don't have a job as a doctor or a lawyer or an accountant or a logger. They got to go to Alberta, they got to go to the United States. That doesn't make any sense. And this is why I build my whole career on saying, you know, this has got to work for the individual, it's got to work for the family, and it's got to work for the community. And I really can't stray from that.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Open Connection. The greatest distance in the existence of man is not from here to there, but the connection from his mind and heart. If we can conquer that distance, we can soar like an eagle and realize our immensity within. I'm Robert Pictou.